finally ready to get America into World War II. It seems like we have been stuck in a rut for quite a while now, but some weird events have been going on in America and definitely in our school. But here it is. We're ready to go off to the tropical island and learn about Pearl Harbor. So let's knock some of the lame stuff out of the way first. This presentation's on your website. If we go back to World War I, you always have to learn about World War I and World War II together. The two just go hand in hand. Remember that we hated our entire experience in World War I. We vowed after World War I to never get involved in European problems again. We shift back to the isolationism that was the traditional American foreign policy. We got sucked in because the propaganda in World War I. We got sucked in because the bankers wanted the $1.5 billion back. 128 Americans were killed in the Lusitania. Maybe 52 American sailors were killed on ships that were sunk in the violation of neutral rights. And there's that Zimmerman note. And none of it really adds up to justifying 133,000 more Americans dying in World War I. And there's about 500,000 people wounded. And if you had me for freshman world history, talked about Grandpa Stumps, which is based on my great Uncle Jim. He lost both his legs in 1918 France. Americans came back bitter. They just wanted nothing to do with any future war. So as World War II hits the horizon, Congress literally passes these neutrality acts. And if you analyze them closely, we don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but everything that got us into World War I, Congress passed laws against to keep us out of World War II. No weapon sales to countries at war. So the U.S. cannot be mistakenly believed to be taking sides. No loans to countries at war, so the bankers can't push us anymore. We do have to make a living in America, so oil, rubber, and steel were sold cash and carry. This is particularly important to this Japanese segment. Japan lived off our oil, our rubber, and our steel. This is why they invaded China, to get steel from Manchuria. They want the Vietnam area for the rubber, and if they push south into some of the islands that the British own, they can get oil. They want their own resources. As long as we're selling it to them, we're okay, but we do reach a point later where, as they're abusing the Chinese, we stop selling it to them, and that helps prod Japan toward attacking us. They could tell that someday we're going to be in the war anyway. No travel on foreign passenger ships. The old Lusitania example. Keep Americans at home. Don't sell stuff to countries at war, and you can avoid war. Of course, Americans have a hard time following the rules. FDR is rule breaker number one. He loves England. He is scared to death during the Battle of Britain that England's going to fall. He realizes that America's probably going to get in the war someday anyway, so we need England. We need England as our friend, and we need allies. We're going to need Russia in a two-front war against Germany. So FDR starts preparing for war. He makes a famous speech called the fire analogy, where he makes fun of the neutrality acts by saying, if your neighbor's house is on fire, and in the middle of the night your neighbor comes screaming at your front door or banging on the door, would you demand cash for your water hose up front, or would you just give it to him to let us put his house out? Would you demand that he carry the water hose himself, or would you help him hook up their water hose and help put out your neighbor's house? Because if your neighbor's house is on fire, pretty good chance that your house is going to catch on fire. FDR argues we need to help England now and save them before Germany gets to us. So we start evolving toward the war with the Lend-Lease Act, which gave England some destroyers, some small ships to fight the German submarines, and in trade we got some bases in the Caribbean. But as everybody knows, the real thing that gets us into the war, and this will totally change our view on World War II, is Pearl Harbor. Hopefully you know all about that, but we'll say a few things about it just in case. But let's take a field trip to the actual tropical islands. Here we are at St. Genevieve High School. If you would have been going to high school in December of 1941, this would have been your high school. It was a New Deal WPA project. The people of St. Genevieve were put to work building this fancy brand new high school in the 1930s. So this is where most of you would have went to school. Of course, if you're African American, you would have went down the street to the all African American high school. That's just the way it was back then. So let's see. let us prepare for blast off to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. And we're blasting. And here we are, right above Pearl Harbor. We're going to squeeze back out to the mega view, though. To really understand Pearl Harbor, we have to go back to the Alfred Thayer Mahan thesis. Mahan is one of those most important Americans that nobody's ever really heard of, that has had the most influence upon American history. Mahan said that if America wanted to be a great power like England, mostly, but he looked at the history of the Greeks and the Romans. He looked at the totality of history, and he argued that the best way to become a great power is you have to have a great navy, just England had a great navy. Because if you want to go out and trade, this is the late 1800s Mahan is writing. This is America over here, and we were making most of the world's goods in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Just America was making more goods than the rest of the world combined. So it was a backwards world back then compared to today. We wanted to get those goods over here to China, exactly the opposite of today's world, and we wanted to sell our goods to the millions, the tens of millions, even the hundreds of millions of Chinese people. And so to get our navy all the way across the Pacific Ocean after the Industrial Revolution and ships were steam-powered, you must have those gas station islands. And so we took Hawaii from the Hawaiians in the 1890s. We overthrew, technically, people living on Hawaii overthrew Liliuokalani. The descendants of American missionaries overthrew Liliuokalani and made Hawaii part of America so they could avoid sugar tariffs and sell their sugar for cheaper than Cuban sugar. It's the first in our chain of gas station islands, and as we go along out here, you can see this Google Earth is great. The archipelago extends out here. Midway Island is about here. It is exactly in the center of the Pacific, so they call it Midway. And then you have Guam and Wake, and our ultimate thing was the Philippines. Way over here is going to be our Walmart of the Pacific. If we actually turn Google Earth, the Philippines are just in the middle of everything. If we hop islands and get our goods to the Philippines, then we can trade with Japan, which we forced to trade in 1853, China, the French owned Vietnam, we can trade there, and we can go down to Australia down here. The Philippines are literally our Walmart of the Pacific, and it was the center of our empire, named after King Philip of Spain, and we took them from Spain in the Spanish-American War. And so this view shows us Japan is barely on the edge of the map here. California is barely on the edge of the map here. Most people don't realize just how far away from everything Hawaii literally is. We were convinced after World War I that we would never go back to war. And so we did not keep up with military technology. We were convinced that based on World War I and before technology, there's just no way to attack Hawaii way out here in the middle of everywhere. So Pearl Harbor makes the perfect naval base for us. Japan's way over here. We knew Japan might be hostile to us someday, but they would have to get battleships. Keep in mind, America's stuck in World War I and before. They'd have to get battleships all the way out here, and surely we would see their battleships coming before they attacked Pearl Harbor. We did not keep up with airplane technology. We did not believe there was any way for Japan to fly airplanes from Japan all the way to Pearl Harbor and bomb it. And indeed, there is no way to fly airplanes that far. What we didn't keep up with was aircraft carrier technology. We knew they existed, we had a few, but we didn't think aircraft carriers were important. We thought they were for transporting airplanes to different places in the world. And what Japan figured out was you can take your airplanes anywhere in the world in an aircraft carrier, launch them from the aircraft carrier, and bomb places like Pearl Harbor. We just didn't think it was technically possible, so we were totally caught by surprise at Pearl Harbor. Then if we zoom in on Pearl Harbor, super close up, right about here, you can see all the advantages of why the Navy thought Pearl Harbor was just absolutely perfect. You have a narrow inlet of deep sea water here through a very narrow neck into the main harbor, which means you can put your entire Navy fleet in here And this narrow neck protects it from the elements like hurricanes and massive Pacific storms. The water in here will remain calm, and the water out in the ocean is going to be crazy. And then for defense, you put artillery on each side of the neck, so if an enemy battleship fleet tries to infiltrate and destroy your fleet, remember we're stuck in that old technology of battleship to battleship slugging it out like Pirates of the Caribbean. We were protected there. There's no way anybody could ever attack our fleet, at least in our minds, before Pearl Harbor actually happened. And if we zoom in closer, feel free to go to Google Maps or Google Earth and do this on your own and explore the actual Pearl Harbor. When we zoom in the middle of the harbor, there's a thing called Ford Island. This was perfect for us too. You could bring your ships in and have a deep water place to dock your ships. Right here on the eastern side of Ford Island, southeastern side of Ford Island, this was Battleship Row, where we kept all of our mainline battleships. All 8 of our battleships were there. They were docked side by side, and I guess ultimately they make a perfect target for Japan. What we were thinking at this time was, and we'll put our battleships here side by side on this island, because we believe the only way they could be attacked on Pearl was for terrorists, basically, to infiltrate the base and plant bombs. The Hawaiian population is 50% Japanese. Most were Japanese Americans, but they had parents or grandparents who were still living in Japan, citizens of Japan. They were still in contact with the Japanese in Japan. They still got newspapers from the hometown. They still got magazines in Japanese language. And so the Japanese are very family connected due to their Confucian history. We mostly feared that some Japanese people out here on Hawaii would try to infiltrate Pearl and blow up our ships. Sabotage. Easiest solution, park all your ships side by side so a few guards at all times could see a rowboat crossing the harbor here and stop them from crossing the harbor. Same for our airfields. Good example of an airfield is right here in the middle of Ford's Island. You can see the airstrips here. You park the airplanes in the middle of the field, and then a few guards could always protect them from any acts of sabotage or terrorism. It was the way we thought before Pearl Harbor. Of course, when the Japanese airplanes flew in, it made easy targets, but we just did not believe it was humanly possible for Japanese airplanes to get to Pearl Harbor at this point. Oh, let's zoom in even more. Give you an idea of what we're talking about. The battleships of World War II. USS Missouri is currently at Pearl Harbor. Keep in mind this is a view from space, how large these battleships actually are. We believe giant battleships would win the next war, just like England had believed forever and ever, keeping the biggest navy on Earth. If I zoom in, you can see there's 3 sets of gun turrets, one here, one back here in the rear. Those are 16-inch artillery pieces on these battleships. 16 inches means the shell they deliver is 16 inches in diameter. A 30-30 shell is the size of a pinky. And if you've ever shot a 30-30 or 30-06, a high-powered rifle, they're pretty powerful. You can shoot a deer at 200 or 300 yards with a shell full of gunpowder the size of your pinky. So imagine the massive firepower behind these ships with 16-inch battleship guns. It just would have been ridiculous. They could shoot for miles upon miles with accuracy and penetrate enemy armor on their battleships. We're gonna try to zoom in here and take a little tour of the USS Missouri. Drop our little googly guy here and we'll see what happens. Maybe nothing. So I'm doing everything the hard way. Well, there's a close-up of the guns, and we'll just do it that way. And there's a view as if you're on the USS Missouri at this time, and hopefully gives an idea of how just massive it is. I don't really want to change the street view because we're gonna come back out anyway, but feel free to explore this completely on your own. So, while we're this close up, notice the white memorial here. This is where the USS Arizona sits. Here's this round piece was one of those gun turrets like the Missouri. The other round piece underwater is the lower bow gun turret. There's one more back here. They were cut off after the bombing, but the USS Missouri, or sorry, USS Arizona still sits here under the water at Pearl. It was too damaged to repair. Almost every other ship that got hit at Pearl Harbor, actually, we repaired. What you can do when you go to Pearl Harbor for real is ride a little boat out to this dock, get off, go into this white memorial, and you can view the remains of the USS Arizona. You can stand on this memorial and look down. It still leaks oil after all of these years. It is phenomenal that it still leaks oil. 80 years after it happened. Inside the memorial you would find the names of everybody that served on the USS Arizona. 15, maybe 1,100-ish guys died on the USS Arizona. It was by far the worst hit ship of Pearl Harbor. While this view gives you a nice view of the Missouri again and how massive these things are. People looking over the sides at the oil in the water and the actual military cemetery of those 1,100 guys that died on the Arizona. And here's just a pair of legs because Google has chopped that man off so he's not in the way. And there's the top of the gun turrets you could see. So again, go explore this stuff on your own and you'll learn ever more than make a forum post about it. I want to zoom back out so we can talk about the actual Japanese plan. They got us so good at Pearl Harbor. It's amazing how good they got us. I'm not defending Japan, but their plan at Pearl Harbor was quite impressive if we go back to space. We'll twist the Earth back into how we're used to seeing it. And then zoom back in. So, here's Pearl Harbor again. Here's Japan, and here's America. We truly just did not believe they could pull this off, not without us knowing about it. We were looking out for attack. We knew tensions are growing high with Japan. We were not 100% surprised that we were attacked. It was where we were attacked that surprised us. We knew Japan wanted to expand their bubble across the Pacific. They were also using the Mahan thesis, and they need those gas station islands, the most important of which are the Philippines down here. We had 75,000 soldiers on the Philippines, including a local guy by the name of Joe Wolf. We had airplanes in the Philippines. We were fully prepared to defend the Philippines. And it's the most logical place for the Japanese to attack. It's what they want, and it's closest. And so logically, if you're a military analyst, the Philippines are the #1 target. And then as you get further away, maybe Guam's the next target, maybe Wake's the next target, maybe Midway's the next target. So it's like, we're 90% sure it's going to be the Philippines. 80% maybe it's going to be Guam, 70% it's going to be Wake, 60% it's going to be Midway, 50-50 on Hawaii, and we're pretty sure they're not ever going to be able to get to California. So we focused our defenses out here on the Philippines, and that's exactly what the Japanese played on. They're smart. They know we're thinking the Americans will expect us at the Philippines, and so we'll do the total opposite of what the Americans expect. And they prepared for a year for this attack. They spent a year practicing. They spent a year planning. The things they did are just amazing at how they tricked us. One example I like to use is the AM radio example. you're all used to your FM radios, which only go about 90 miles. Everything was AM back in these days. And we talked when we talked about 20s music how AM radio can broadcast 500 miles. But then on top of that, there's atmospheric skip, where the radio waves go up to the atmosphere, hit the top, and bounce back down to the earth, bounce off the earth, and back down to the atmosphere. And so AM radio waves can literally go around the world. As I look down here, I got an old 1960 Fender amplifier here. Back in high school when I was playing this dude, it would pick up Mexican radio stations. I'd literally be in the middle of a show, and if I stopped playing the guitar, you could hear Mexican voices speaking Spanish coming through my amplifier because of the atmospheric skip of AM radios. So we're listening to the Japanese radio transmissions. We're listening. Most of them are in code, but we're listening, trying to figure out what we could anyway. Well, they know we're listening. The Japanese aren't stupid people. They literally took, to simplify this, they took their aircraft carriers and their shrimp boats, and they traded names with each other. So that as we're listening in, and the shrimp boats are saying, we're heading north to go catch lobsters or whatever, we truly believe it's their shrimp boats, but it's actually their aircraft carriers. Meanwhile, their aircraft carriers are heading toward the Philippines, going south, at least using aircraft carrier names. It's really the shrimp boats. That makes sense to us and just fuels our belief that, oh, they're sending their aircraft carriers down toward the Philippines. They're clearly going to attack the Philippines. But meanwhile, their aircraft carriers are sneaking way up here to the North Pacific, where no shipping ever happens. These are rough oceans. There's nowhere to trade up here. Nobody's trading with Kamchatka, Russia, and the Aleutian Islands off Alaska. It's empty oceans, but it's rough oceans. The last place you'd actually want to take aircraft carriers or any ships, but Japan does it, and they arc their way across the North Pacific, and they come down north of Pearl Harbor, a direction we would never expect them to come from. And we were no fools. We were flying airplanes out every single day, doing a 500-mile radius. They flew out like spokes from a wheel, searching every single day. They'd fly out 500 miles, fly back the 500 miles, searching for the approach of enemy ships. We were not lazy at Pearl Harbor. We were not asleep even at Pearl Harbor. We just could not possibly foresee it coming. We searched those seas every day except Sundays. Our Christian culture dictates that Sunday is the day of rest, so even the military was taking a day of rest on December 7th, 1941. Japan played upon our Christian culture and attacked us on a Sunday to achieve that complete surprise. They were negotiating in Washington right up to the last minute. They did everything they possibly could to surprise us. Alright, the actual attack. We got some pictures here we can look at. This is getting kind of long, so we'll try to keep her short. This is one of our big mainline battleships here. Clearly rather destroyed. That's a close-up of the Arizona Memorial, where you can see the gun turrets cut off. This is the day of the attack. Battleship Row was hit the absolute hardest. The Japanese airplanes were even to fly in. I'm going to use the term under the radar. They actually got away with the radar. We had radar on during Pearl Harbor. Radar was a brand new technology the British had shared with us. The way the British came upon radar, and it's such a great technology. We use it to predict storms today, the weather, and for military purposes and just pleasure flying and boating. But the intent of radar was so devious in World War II. The British, while they're getting just slaughtered by the Germans in the Battle of Britain, they start doing research on how could we use radio waves to send into the atmosphere, and maybe they'll boil the blood of German pilots. Now, before you think that's too crazy, that's how a microwave works. Microwaves would sort of actually do this in the controlled environment of a microwave oven. The British are experimenting with radio waves, though, and they just believed if they sent radio waves out, maybe it would boil the blood of German pilots. Turns out it hits the metal airplane and bounces back to where you sent it from. So the British got real smart and thought, wait a minute. Using some basic trigonometry, wavelengths and sines and all that stuff, they know the time it takes for a radio wave of a certain wavelength to go a certain distance. And so if it goes that distance and bounces off the airplane and comes back, that's double the time, so you cut it in half. And you can determine how far away the German airplanes are. Translate that to a basic TV screen, which is a result of World War II. And you can get an image of when the Germans are showing up. They shared this with us because England was our friend and we were starting to help them out. So we had radar at Pearl Harbor. Well, since the Japanese planes are coming from the east, like from America, and because we were expecting a shipment of brand new airplanes to fly in from America anytime that day, the radar operators surmised, well, this must be American airplanes coming in and they're friendly. So they did inform their superior officer, who said, nah, that's just got to be some of our guys, don't worry about it. Turns out to be the Japanese, and here you go. Some live action shots. Japanese also sent midget submarines in. Bigger submarines came along and shot these little two-man submarines out of their torpedo chutes. The idea was to infiltrate that narrow net, get inside the harbor, and blow up American ships. And it was a suicide mission. These guys in the midget submarines knew they were going to die. They were not successful at all. We were able to sink their little submarines and pull them up later. Here's one still at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. This is a great view of the actual devastation of Pearl Harbor. These are all on the website. You can explore. Here's our airplane side by side on the airfields, just getting blown up like mad. A poor sailor here trying to help his friend. This is my fave. This is a Japanese picture. They were taking pictures so they could go back and analyze the actual damage they had done at Pearl Harbor. Here's our mainline battleships. It gives you a great view of how they're just side by side out here off Ford's Island. There's a plume of water that gives an idea of that the ships are huge, but if that's a plume of water, that's a massive explosion. There's a little tiny Japanese airplane there. One of the great things about Pearl Harbor and why it was not as effective as they thought it would be, we had junk ships over here, target practice ships, old battleships or other kinds of ships that we used for target practice, and so the tops were lined with plywood, so they looked flat on top. The Japanese pilots believed those might be our aircraft carriers, which is a whole other little tangent we got to get into. We did have 3 aircraft carriers based at Pearl Harbor. Not nearly as many as the Japanese owned or other navies of the world, but we were starting to catch up with military technology as the war breaks out. For defensive protection, the battleship fleet would spend 2 weeks at sea while the aircraft carriers were at Pearl Harbor, getting new food, getting fresh supplies, fresh water, refueling, refitting. And then 2 weeks later, the battleships would come park, and the aircraft carriers would go out to the open ocean and do maneuvers and practice drills. And so there's a 2-week rotation. By sheer coincidence, and we had no idea how important this was going to be. On December 7th, 1941, the battleships were in harbor when the Japanese airplanes came in. They wanted the aircraft carriers. They understood how valuable those aircraft carriers were. So they wanted the carriers to be there. They weren't. Now, they saw these junk ships over here with flat tops, and they wasted a lot of bombs blowing up junk ships. Before they realized, oh no, the carriers aren't here. But they did get our battleships and destroyed most of our battleships, at least temporarily. We are so lucky those aircraft carriers were there. We're not there. We're out to sea. A lot of people use this to fuel the conspiracy theories. But if you can plant yourself in the way we were thinking in 1941, if we had thought the carriers were important in 1941, we would have put them in the harbor for defense, and we would have sent the battleships out to sea so they couldn't be surprise attacked. Our ignorance saves us at Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor taught us how to win World War II against the Japanese. We realized, oh my gosh, it's the aircraft carriers that are important, not the battleships. It's the airplane that's important, not the battleships. So even Japan got us good. They taught us how to win the war, and that's the great irony of Pearl Harbor. Their goal, I didn't really say this in the beginning, but we've so beat it to death over the years. If we loop back to the very beginning of this unit, Japan's a small island with no resources. They start fighting in 1931. It's 10 years later, on December 7th of 1941, when they finally attack Pearl Harbor. So they're 10 years short on resources. They were hoping to get resources from China and the Philippines and the French Indochina and Australia, hoping to get resources before they ever defied America, but things moved faster than they wanted to as far as war with America. Things moved slower than they wanted to as far as war with China. And so, as America was moving toward war, Japan thought, well, we can't fight America in a long war. We'll lose. We'll run out of resources. We've wasted 10 years of resources already. America has endless resources. So the whole idea of Pearl Harbor was to punch us out before we were in the war. That's why they snuck attack us in such a dastardly way. But the bottom line irony is it just didn't work. It failed. It taught us how to win the war. The way I would explain this in class is I'd pick the biggest, strongest person in class, some big guy, and I would declare him that we're mortal enemies and we got to fight someday. But my problem is I'm old and I'm fat and I have no resources. I got about 30 seconds to win a fight versus any strapping high school youth has been running at least a mile in gym, has been weightlifting, staying fairly fit. If I start a fight with that person, I'm going to lose. If I don't win in 30 seconds, I'm going to lose because 37 seconds into it, my fat body's going to have to sit down and get some breath. And so I would not even try to fight them. I would create the most boring lecture possible, probably this one about Pearl Harbor, or maybe the Missouri-Arkansas border war of 1837. And I would put that person to sleep, and then I'd pick up a chair, and I would smash their skull in with that chair. That was Japan's intent, to put us into a coma before we realized we were in the war. Now, think about Bugs Bunny cartoons for a minute. If I smash that person's skull with my chair, and instead of actually smashing the skull, the chair bends into the shape of their head and rattles me away like a cartoon vibrating character, and they stand up and laugh at me, I've got a serious problem. Because now the fight's going to last more than 30 seconds, and this is where we're going to set you up for suspense. If I just outright slugfest them, I'm going to lose. And 37 seconds later, I'm out of breath, I'm going to lose. I have to get them to fall asleep again. Now, how in the world am I ever going to get them to fall asleep again? I could start on my Italian-American War lecture of 1846, but surely after I hit them in the head once with a chair, they're not going to fall asleep. It's Japan's only chance, though. They have to trick us again into another surprise attack. And that surprise attack is going to be the Battle of Midway. Great movie was released last November at Midway, and this involves the Coral Sea Battle too, but I think this is a great place to leave you in classic suspense for the day. So hit me with forum questions. Without an audience here, I don't get the questions that fuel more and more and more discussion. Like I just thought of a good story. Ships like the USS Oklahoma turned over on their side and guys are trapped in air bubbles for 3 days. For 3 days we tried to cut them out of ships with cutting torches, but before the banging from the inside stopped. The most tragic example I ever read about that was we were able to haul back up all these ships eventually and use the steel, if not fix the actual ship. We fixed all the ships except for the Arizona, but they found a smaller ship much later in the war, years later, and in the engine room they found two bodies, what was left of 2 bodies, and these guys had enough food and enough water in the engine room to live. They made scratches on the wall to mark the days. They lived to almost Christmas. So you guys, you have a good sense of how slow time can move. Imagine being trapped underwater from December 7th until almost Christmas. It would just be heartbreaking and tragic. And so I think that's a good place to leave you with that thought. And that loops us back to how brutal Japan could be during World War I and why we used the bombs later. Why in the world are you still watching this with my hat head in your face?